Hi everyone, and welcome back to our video on how to write a language essay. In the first part of this video, we've already been looking at how to structure this essay. But in part 2, we're going to be looking at those little additional pieces of information and advice that you can use to really make sure that your essay stands out above the rest. So, firstly, we're going to be looking at some hints for writing language essays. So once you've got that structure in place, these are the things that you need to add to that structure. So the first tip is to be very specific with techniques. So for example, if you've used the term imagery, you can be more specific by saying things like metaphor or extended metaphor. So if you look again back to that language glossary that we looked at in a previous video, you'll see that, using words like imagery, although they're technically correct, they're not quite as specific and correct as they absolutely could be. So just making these little changes makes your essay a lot more correct and very specific, which is what the marker is going to be looking for. You can check with your teacher or your tutor about refining your choice of terms. Secondly, you want to be showing off your diversity. So, for example, if you've already used the technique imagery, like we discussed, try to use a different technique like alliteration in your next paragraph. So this is really a way of showing off almost to the marker. You want to make sure that they know you know a lot of different techniques and you're not just repeating that one technique over and over and over again. You're showing off your skills, that you're a good English student who's done your study and that you're approaching this essay with background knowledge. For example, you could use techniques like metaphor, personification, and allusion. These sort of techniques are more specific and they're going to look more impressive to the marker. A third technique is to be careful of your language. Now, in essays, it's better to be very straightforward and formal. So in your style, you really want to be very logical, very structured, and to speak in a very formal way. So avoid those casual, conversational tones. So it's really important, though, that you do use language that you're comfortable with, rather than borrowing terms. So it can be quite tempting to go to the thesaurus and look up hundreds of fancy words and then use them in your essay. But often what happens when you do that is you find that you're not completely understanding the words that you're using 100% and you're muddling the meaning a lot. So it's better to use terms of your own and then just maybe using one or two really fancy words per paragraph to get that good mixture of, simple logical structure and also just a little bit of flair to make it interesting. So use the thesaurus for some impressive words, but not too many. Now we're going to be looking at the important aspect of essay style. Style is often something that's looked over. It's thought, that isn't important, style isn't the guts of the essay, so I don't need to worry about it. But once you've got your structure and your content in place, it's really important that you, make your essay a bit interesting by making use of style. So firstly, you need to be thinking about whether you're using first or third person. So just as a refresher, first person is when you say things like I and me, whereas third person is where you might be saying things like the reader or one. So it's best in essays to use third person. As we've just discussed, essay needs to be really quite formal in style, and this is a way of achieving that formality. First person is acceptable in personal responses. So if the question literally says, what do you think about this text? Then it is acceptable to use first person, but in every other situation, it's really just not appropriate to be using this quite informal tone. Secondly, you want to be looking out for grammar. Now, it's important to be accurate in your grammar, especially in language study essays, because, the essay is examining you on your use of language, and grammar is a very important part of that. So it's better to use present tense to discuss your text and maintain this. This can be quite tricky, so you need to pay attention. Always check that you're using the right tense and that you're being consistent, not jumping between different ones. Thirdly, we get to the structure of sentences. So it's really important that you use some short sentences and some long sentences. Really just mixing up your paragraphs. You don't want your essays to be monotonous by every sentence being the same. So if you mix them up a bit, it makes it more interesting to read. Within the sentences, you should focus on language and expression, so making your sentences clear and very articulate. You can also be using things like dashes, colons, and semicolons to break up the sentences. So this is a way of making sure that you can have those longer sentences, but they're not really blurred and muddly because, there's no punctuation. If you do have long sentences, you want to be making sure they're broken up by appropriate punctuation marks. So, in conclusion, we're going to be looking at how you can ensure that you answer the question. Now, as I've mentioned earlier in this video, often students write essays that are really good, they're full of great content, but they don't answer the question that they were asked to answer. So that great essay that they've prepared isn't really worth anything to the marker because it's not answering the question. And you may think that this is, very obvious, but it's often a mistake that people make. So let's look at the way in which you can make sure that your essay is really tailor-made to whatever question's being asked. So in your introduction, you need to state the answer and the argument in the topic sentence. So first sentence, straight away, you're answering that question in very clear terms. Secondly, you need to list your text clearly and accurately. You also need to explain text by specifying their background and context, but then specifically linking that to the essay question. So not just introducing the text, but saying, this text relates to the question through this technique. You then need to list ideas in the text which you'll be using, just to make it very obvious to the marker the direction that you're taking the essay in. And these subpoints are obviously the sort of sub-elements to answering the question. You then need to get to the body. Now, this is where you should imagine the body as the layers of filling of your essay. So remember, it's really important to only cover one theme per paragraph. And obviously by doing that, you're making sure that you really cover each theme very well. You're not glossing over the themes, but making sure they're really well expressed. You then need to use a strict and repetitive structure to make sure your essay is easy to follow and that your ideas and arguments don't get lost in a big blur of words. You should also remember to use 1 to 4 quotes per paragraph to make sure you're always being specific and accurate. It's also really important that you constantly reference back to techniques. Remember, this is a language essay, so the key thing is to make sure that you're always referencing language. You're not just referencing the text, but specifically language examples in that text. So finally, we get to the conclusion. Now, it's really important that the conclusion, as we've discussed, doesn't just summarize your points, but it shows a really clear personal response to the question. It's also really useful if you end on an interesting or thoughtful social comment to impress the marker. And again, to show that you've taken the question and you've made something meaningful out of that. So that brings us to the end of our video on how to write a language essay. So from this video, you can really take away not only information about how to structure your essays, but also some of the really important ways in which you can improve your essays through style to make sure they're impressive, and also how to make sure your essays answer the question every time. So by using these techniques and applying them to writing practice essays and exam responses, you're well on your way to a really good essay for this subject.